Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's special COVID-19 webinar hosted by the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. We thank you for joining us today and appreciate all you're doing to help children during this challenging time. COVID-19 has turned everything upside down and inside out. For many people, the pandemic is compounding all the other stressors and survival issues they face on a daily basis, with detrimental consequences to children and families. The question has to be asked whether lockdown in Africa may be more dangerous to our children than the virus itself. In this webinar, Dr. Joan Van Niekerk, child rights consultant and past president of ISPCAN, and Edith Creel, executive director and founder of the nonprofit organization Jelly Beans, will share the experiences of children living in under-resourced countries. They will address strategies to respond adequately to these challenges, including what children need to deal with the emotional consequences of the pandemic. As caregivers, communities, and child protection professionals, we all need to find effective ways to address the potential of a decades-long mental health impact. Right now, I have everyone on mute to avoid background noise. We welcome you to enter your questions in the questions box throughout the presentation. You can also share your comments about your COVID-19 experiences in the questions box as well. The presenters will respond to questions and comments at the end as time permits. And please note that the slides for today's presentation and other documents are available now in the handout section of this webinar. And also a reminder that a recording of the webinar and the slides will be available after at ispcan.org. Edith Creel is the founder and executive director of Jelly Beans, an NPO that assists children who have experienced trauma, abuse, and neglect. She is a social worker who has specialized in trauma for the last 26 years with a focus on sexual abuse. She has developed a number of projects, including the Teddy Bear Clinic, the Child Witness Project, the Healing Project for children who have been sexually abused, and the Anatomical Doll Project in South Africa. She also co-authored Voices of Hope, Healing Stories for Africa's Children and Our Bodies, which helps parents and teachers talk to young children about sexuality. Edith often presents seminars to multiple disciplines on child trauma, protection, and mental health. Joan Van Niekerk has worked in child protection in South Africa for more than 30 years, working with both child victims and their families, as well as children in conflict with the law. She was chairperson of the South Africa Law Reform Commission Project Committee on Sexual Offenses, which culminated in the reform of legislation dealing with sexual offenses, and has participated actively in other law and policy reforms related to child protection. Dr. Van Niekerk worked at Childline South Africa for more than 20 years, has worked as a trainer and consultant across sub-Saharan Africa and around the world, and has written many articles, manuals, and book chapters related to child protection. She served as an ISPCAN counselor from 2006 to 2018 and was president of ISPCAN from 2014 to 2016. Joan and Edith, we thank you so much for being with us today and for your many contributions to child protection. I will now turn it over to Joan.
Right, thank you. I am going to pull up my presentation, so I hope that it's going to come up on full. And greetings to everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's great to be able to present and share. And as Heather has already said, please feel free to share your comments as well as your questions in the bar to the left-hand side of your screen. Has my screen come up yet?
Yes, if you could put it in full screen mode. Right.
Full screen mode,
there.
right.
Yes. Oh, right up at the top.
Is it in full screen?
Hold
yeah.
on one sec. Right there.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Yes, now the title of our presentation comes out of a discussion between Edith and myself, who have been working throughout throughout the COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa. And we've looked at the impact of lockdown, and we really wonder whether or not lockdown is more dangerous than the virus itself. So we'll share some of our experiences with you. We would like you to comment, as I've already said, because this will enrich the content of the webinar. Now, lockdown in South Africa was announced on the 23rd of March. It was implemented on the 27th of March. I think that date is incorrect. There's another date that I'm coming to around the 28th that I want to mention. And the purpose of the lockdown was not to prevent so much the spread of the COVID-19 virus, because this was seen as inevitable in South Africa, given the challenges we have, but rather to contain the initial rapid escalation of the infection, to enable the preparation of medical facilities and resources for the anticipated numbers of patients, and to flatten the curve of the infection. And certainly it does seem to have achieved that purpose to some extent. Now, Edith and I work in the epicenter of the pandemic in South Africa. At the moment, we are working in the Western Cape, which at the moment has about 60 to 70% of all COVID-19 infections in the country. And that is totally disproportionate to our population. There are many proposed reasons for this. We're not going to discuss those. Then we had the double whammy. On the 28th of March, we had the international rating agencies, Moody, announcing that they had rated us as having junk status in South Africa, as a country, in terms of international investment. And this was particularly perturbing because what it means is that investors leave the country, and already we were in a recessionary period with slow growth, high unemployment. It was a real economic disaster and a real blow to the economy that was already in crisis, and it came the day after we went into lockdown. So as I proceed, you'll see how it kind of really doubled the job losses, etc. Heather, I don't seem to be able to change my slides. Let me try again.
Okay.
If you're able to take it on to the next one, my
okay, I see that.
There we go.
Okay.
There we go. We also in South Africa have high levels of domestic violence and child abuse, to the extent that during 2019, our president called this a national crisis, and he actually started a whole process of dealing with the high levels of domestic violence that we have. We also have pre-existing health issues with very poor health facilities. We have a very high level of HIV and AIDS. About 16% of our population is infected. High levels of tuberculosis, which might be misspelt. I'm sorry about that. And health services that were limited and under enormous pressure as a result of HIV and AIDS and tuberculosis. And I just want to draw your attention to the World Health Organization, who said the following: the health of the most vulnerable people among us is a determining factor for the health of all of us. And I think this is very true in South Africa. Now, how did life change? How did lockdown have an impact? We had 5 levels of lockdown that were announced. And we started off with level 5 with the most serious limitations on public freedoms. And we had to stay at home. This was strictly enforced by the army and police. And in talking to one of our struggle veterans, Joyce Sawani, she said, this actually feels like the return of the apartheid management of the townships. So you can imagine the impact of suddenly having the army and police in our communities again. It meant no outside exercise outside of our homes, no walking in parks, no walking on the street, no going to the beaches. Schools, gyms, restaurants, hotels, etc., all closed. Shops were open, and shops were only allowed to sell essential goods. So when you go into the shops still, you will see certain shelves that are actually crossed off with tape that you are not allowed to take goods from. Only essential service providers were allowed to travel to and from work, and only the manufacturers of food and essential provisions and products, such as medical supplies, were allowed to operate. Other people who had other work were not allowed to go to work. And for many, this has meant the collapse of business and also, of course, the collapse of jobs. Now, the sale of alcohol and cigarettes was also banned. In theory, a great idea, but it didn't take into account the addictive nature of these substances and the fact that adults who were dealing with sudden withdrawal would be confined to their homes with their children and families. Now, I used to work in an addiction center. First of all, people can become really ill with alcohol addiction, but there is the stress of the addiction process that was not taken into account. No assistance was available for those who kind of went through that withdrawal process. And what I haven't mentioned here, it's also contributed to a thriving and active black market in cigarettes, with people coming over the border from Zimbabwe with suitcases of cigarettes to sell in South Africa. But of course, on black market levels, you are paying a highly inflated price. Messages from government, and you can see on the left hand of the screen a summary of the alert levels. I'm not going to read that, it's too, but you can go back to it if you want to revisit the slides. So messages from government were sometimes conflicting. Sometimes we got mixed messages about masks, sanitizer, and so on. And also, it's clear that many of our population are not clear as to the purpose of the lockdown. This was not repeated often enough or explained sufficiently. After all, most of our adult population come from a schooling environment which is questionable in terms of quality. What does flattening the curve mean to a semi-literate population, particularly older adults? It actually means nothing to them. So using that term in order to explain the purpose of the lockdown was ununderstandable. Also remembering that English is not the language of the majority of our population, but our official language is English. It didn't take into account the country's lack of preparedness for lockdown, and it did not take into account the circumstances of many communities. Now, the upper picture shows you how many of our rural people live in fairly informal dwellings. The lower picture is one of Kailicha. And if you look at the closeness of the houses together, and look at the fact that many of these houses are single-room dwellings, just staying inside permanently and not going outside on the street at all is a fairly kind of tall order. But look at some of the other messages. Wash your hands with soap. How do I do this if I live in a poor and rural community that has no clean piped water? Stay in your home. What do you do if your home has no toilet and you have to use a communal toilet, as in many informal settlements? Wear a mask. Well, where do I get one and what kind of mask? I had a real chuckle today. I was collating responses from the children's consultation that Childline has done. And children are calling a lot of the children are calling the masks nose bags. And those of you who have horses, I'm sure will find that quite amusing. Okay. What changed for parents and caregivers? And remember, the health of the parent or the caregiver, when I use the term parent, I mean caregiver of the child, has a direct impact on the well-being of their child. Not just their physical health, their mental and emotional and psychosocial health as well. So they are under considerable stress. They're anxious about their own health and the health of their children. They're, in many instances, unable to provide for their children as they had either lost their jobs or else would not be paid. Because so many firms have crashed, and because they have no income, they're unable to pay their staff if they do not have a kind of a nest egg or a capital amount. As schools close, their role also changed because they had to assume the role of teachers to prevent children falling behind at school. And as many parents are semi-literate, this is a huge challenge. And of course, the confining of children in small spaces. How do you confine a toddler in a single room with maybe a few other children and one or two adults? It's a huge challenge. They were unable to feed their families, and the lockdown also coincided with a cold spell, particularly in the Western Cape, and many were unable to clothe their families appropriately with the onset of winter, and it subsequently got even colder. The experiences of lockdown were also vastly different for different sectors of the population, and the contrasts between the rich and the poor are extreme. If you look at the lower picture of Khayelitsha, wow, that is a very difficult community to be under lockdown in. If you look at the upper picture, which is of a fantastic home in Bantry Bay, which is a suburb of Cape Town, how wonderful to be in lockdown with a swimming pool, which is probably heated, a lovely house, big veranda that you can perhaps run on, etc., etc. Two vastly different experiences. And Friedman, who's one of our major legal advisors, made the statement, pandemics don't heal divisions, they actually reveal them. Also of concern was the inappropriately heavy hand of the police and army, which has resulted in the death of at least 2 community members and multiple arrests and many fines to communities who often cannot afford to pay these fines. Now, I just want to pause there for a moment because we are alarmed, but also in a way impressed by what has happened across America with the death of the Black man who was killed by the policeman who had his knee on this man's neck and chest. How wonderful the country has come out and said this is not acceptable. And someone made the comment in our newspaper today that we should be ashamed that we have not made more noise about the death of our community members, particularly the one person who was shot, in order to make sure that people were treated equally and that unnecessary and brutal deaths like this are prevented in future. And I do want to mention that I think it's quite an important point for us as South Africans to reflect on. So, sorry, 2 slides. I forgot to delete the one. We also had massive challenges for child protection. Now, initially, veterinary services were regarded as essential services, but not child protection services. I don't know what you think of that. That we are more kind of concerned about the protection of our animals than we are about our children. Okay. But this brought initially the NGOs together working in protection services to lobby for the inclusion of protection services as essential services to children during lockdown. And we won that particular achievement. And we managed to have them declared as essential services, and we could continue providing those services. But state and NGOs, some NGO services, not all joined the very active lobby, came to a grinding halt. There was a dearth of child protection services, and the child protection lobby then worked with government to motivate the services and to develop crisis policies, such as developing standard operating procedures for managing child protection issues. And here I want to acknowledge the role played by UNICEF. Thank you, UNICEF. I don't know if there's anybody from UNICEF on this webinar, but they played a very active role in keeping communication between the NGO sector and government open. And we began to develop more partnerships between government and NGOs. But we are still struggling with state CP services. For example, in 4 weeks, we haven't achieved safe care for an abused mother and her children who were exposed to serious domestic violence between their parents, fueled by alcohol. We see a failure to ensure that children come to therapy. We also see a lack of acknowledgement of the contribution that NGOs working in the field of child protection are making, and also no funding. And I'm sad to say, but I'm also proud to say, that many of our NGO staff are working on reduced salaries and working long hours. We also had to assume some new roles. The provision of food, for example. Many NGOs began to feed the hungry. Then government intervened, closed soup kitchens and NGO distribution, saying that all food provision had to be distributed through government. This was a total failure. They were unable to reach all who needed food. Food parcels contained items that required cooking, but many families had no fuel, gas, or electricity. Because they hadn't been paid, they couldn't buy these resources. And levels of corruption relating to food parcels were high. And I want to just use as an illustration an email I got from a colleague in rural Mpumalanga, which is the northeast of the country. We had to continue distributing food parcels. Government was distributing the parcels under the banner of the ANC, not acknowledging the donors, because most of the food is coming from donor companies. Some areas were only giving to the supporters of that particular party. Some unscrupulous councillors and government workers were selling the food which had been donated. Food parcels were only going to South African citizens and not to foreign residents who were equally hungry. And sometimes things were taken out of the food parcel that was being distributed because it was a desired object or a desired resource.
Joan, excuse me, so sorry to interrupt. I've had a couple attendees ask if you could close that dialog box on the bottom of your screen.
Oh, okay, right.
Just covering a bit of, thank you so much.
Has it gone?
Yes.
Sorry, people. Right. Unfortunately, I've got to keep my access open to the internet, otherwise you'll lose me. A child's response to corruption in her community that we got in the children's consultation was like this: government must act harsh. I'm using her words and her grammar. Government must act harsh to police and other enforcers who abuse children and also solicit bribes from members of the community. I thought that was quite insightful from someone between the age of 13 and 15. And it's clear that that child must have experienced something that led to that comment. So what did we do? We ignored the regulation regarding the distribution of food, and we continued to distribute food. The government regulation was challenged in court by a group of NGOs and overturned. What about the impact on children? Little was known how children are experiencing the lockdown. However, Childline South Africa and another NGO called Media Monitoring Africa have begun processes of child consultation. And this is where Edit picks up from me and carries on.
Okay,
Great.
thank you.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, one moment.
I wonder, Heather, would it be possible just to give me a quick video shot so that I could just say hello to people? I have a little something that they might make them laugh.
Yes, you can click on your webcam icon right below your microphone icon to turn it on your end. Right below the green.
Goodness.
Do you see it right below the green microphone button, just below that one? You should be able to turn on your webcam.
There we go. Is that working?
Nope, not yet.
Oh, man.
But you know, it says it's waiting to view your screen, so maybe there's a bit of a delay.
Okay, so let's just do that quickly.
Okay, hold on, everyone. We're trying to get her screen. There we go. Now you can try your webcam.
Okay, let's try that again. Oh, goodness. Technology and I are not the best of friends.
At the top
right.
of your, okay. At the top of your screen, there should be a way to share your webcam at the very top.
Here we go. I think I might have found it. Hey, there we go. Camera's
there.
on?
Yes.
All right. So, I wonder if you can see what's happening in the background.
Just a little bit of your bookshelf. No problem.
Well, have a look at how many books are in there and how many teddy bears with masks are in there. So all of our teddy bears that sit in our offices have all gotten masks.
That looks like fun.
Yeah, I thought it was a pretty good idea. All right, so let's just carry on then with the slides. I'm just going to put them up for you, everyone. Can everyone see the slides?
Yes. And your webcam is still on. Okay.
Yep. Okay, there we go.
Great.
All right, so, you know, Jonah shared a lot of the kind of the bigger issues that we're dealing with. And for me, you know, I tend to work more with the individual, the family, the community, you know, and that's kind of where my expertise lies. And I'd really like to speak about that in terms of how we're dealing with the crisis at the moment. And I'd like to start off just with a comment by Dr. Bruce Perry, which I'm hoping all of you know, you know, where he's saying that the real crisis of this pandemic is not necessarily the next 6 months, but what it really is what are we going to do with the social and emotional toll that this is having on individuals and families who will remain the most marginalized for the next 6 decades. And I think this really was something that made me sit up and think that what we are doing now, or what we are not doing now, will have an impact on our families and communities for the next 6 decades, which is both overwhelming, but also very inspirational. All right, so now we're trying to go on to the next slide. Here we go. There we go. All right, so just to give you a little bit of insight into what some of our children are saying about the lockdown and, you know, what they've been seeing. So an 18-year-old said, when they announced that there was to be a lockdown, I freaked out because I felt like it was the end of the world and we're all going to die, which is ironic since I'm home all day, every day, but now I feel trapped inside my house. Perhaps I'm claustrophobic. I worry about my mom. She's in hospital. Governments should not allow the selling of alcohol because they think it's a bad idea as people make bad choices when they are drunk. So many people are dying and getting infected with the virus. I worry that everyone is going to die. I think that they should check on children more regularly and make sure that when they talk to children, to allow children to give more honest answers. Because most children are hurt and prefer to bottle up their emotions. And so they should be free to speak because we do not know if they're being abused or if everything is okay at home or not, or how they are feeling. They should communicate more with children and visit them more often. This was really insightful for me for a child between the ages of 10 and 12, and really saying that we don't quite know what's going on with our children at this point in time. We're anticipating that the violence is increasing in homes, the abuse is increasing, but until we start being able to interact again with children, it's very difficult to actually know, what is happening to our statistics. Oh my. Okay, sorry, I keep on losing my little button to go to the next slide. I found it just now. Oh, here we go. Sorry.
Okay.
All right. So, in terms of the poll and the research that Childline did, some of the biggest concerns that children mentioned was the loss of their school year, in particular the older grades. The children who are nearing matric, who had plans next year. Many children fear that they're going to catch the virus. They fear going back to school because they fear the virus. They have a lot of anxiety about family health. Children missed going to school, having the interaction of friends, of teachers, of a space outside of just home. Feelings of sadness and stress, there was a lot of, kind of expression of that. Many children experienced boredom at home, and a significant number expressed that they were happy at home with family and spending time with family, which I think is really positive to hear too, because it's not just for all children. It's not the possibility only of abuse and violence, but for many children, I think this was a really nice time to be spending special time with families. So these are some of the feedback that we've received from our children. Now, what I'd like to focus on very briefly, and I'm not quite sure in terms of my audience as to how many of you are aware of the work of Dr. Bruce Perry, but I find it a very useful way of trying to think about how trauma, distress impacts on our behavior, on our feelings, on our thoughts. So if you have a look on the left-hand side, you will see that what we're depicting there is a brain that is going through a good time. So if I can use the words, that all parts of the brain, thinking, the feeling, the regulation in the body, and the survival strategies that the body has, they're all working together. And this child is really able to work with all parts of their brain. They're all online. And so thinking in, for instance, a school environment is possible because this child is in a state of calm and everything is working together. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, what happens to our brain during times of extreme stress and trauma? What happens here is that our focus is on survival, and the thinking brain goes offline, if I can use those words. Dr. Bruce Perry, please forgive me because this is really an oversimplification of your model, but I think it's really important for all of us who are working on the front line with children to have a better understanding of what does trauma and distress and abuse and violence do to children in terms of their abilities to learn. So in South Africa, everybody's panicking about going back to school. Parents are worried that their children are not up to date. Other parents are worried because they didn't have time to do the schoolwork. And teachers are worried about how they're going to get the whole curriculum into what's left of the year. And what really concerns me is that there's going to be a lot of focus when children go back to school on teaching, on learning, on using our thinking brain. But in reality, many of our children are in survival mode. They are working from a place of fear, a place of extreme anxiety, and that their thinking brains have gone offline. So I think it's really important for us to understand this so that we can then have more appropriate responses to, children in general. One of the models that I've found really very helpful, and it actually comes from more attachment-based work, is the head, heart, and hands. What I like about it is that it's helping us remember that trauma is stored in our heads, so we have thoughts about it, we remember things, we have feelings about it, a whole range of feelings, but we also have bodily sensations. So we have trauma stored in our bodies. And it's really important for all of us to be helping children to process not just their thoughts, not just their feelings, but what is happening into their bodies, in their bodies. So that would be, how are we holding our stress? So some of us, maybe you can feel the stress in your shoulders. Other people are clenching their stomachs. So for me, it's really important to think all three of those aspects need attention. So if we were working with the child, we need to think about what might they be thinking, feeling, and experiencing, and what is this leading to in terms of their behavior. But then at the same time, how can we respond with this understanding? So how can I respond in an insightful way to the child's thoughts, the child's feelings, and the bodily sensations that the child is experiencing? It's not just about talking children and saying, don't be scared. I'm sure you've all had the experience of, you say you're nervous about something and somebody says to you, don't be nervous. Well, you know what? That's not really very helpful. We can't talk people out of fear, and behavior is very often directed by our biology. So we often think we act before we think. So what does this mean for us on the front line? How do we begin to help children lower their levels of distress or physiological arousal? So we know that stress happens in the body, in the brain. Where do we begin? Because I'm saying to you now, actually, we can't talk children out of fear. We can't talk children out of distress. Okay, so now what? And I think the two most important things just to think about is that it starts with connection and regulation. So if I can just comment on the little picture of the little girl in the slide, what she's doing is she's got a very close connection with her little baby that she's carrying on her back. And at the same time, if her little baby were to be distressed, the fact that she's got the closeness, the fact that she's moving with her little baby, there's rhythm to her walking, these are some of the things that we know help to regulate our anxieties and fears. So I just thought it was a really lovely little way of just reminding us of that. One of the ways of thinking about connection, I love the 5 love languages, and I find it a really easy and lovely concept to share with communities. How do we show caring? How do we show love? And parents need ideas. They need help because they often have not come from experiences where this was showed and demonstrated to them. And one of the things that we obviously also need to think about is we know one of children's love languages is physical touch. And so now with the virus, what does that mean? A lot of children are worried about not being able to hug their mom or dad. Yesterday, I was walking past a little girl in our office who'd come for a therapy session. And, as I sort of walked, not very close, but as I walked near her, she immediately took a step back. and she had this look of panic on her face. And I thought to myself, what are children understanding about connection now? How are they experiencing this fact that the social distancing, we're not allowed to touch, we're not allowed to, so we really need to become experts in ensuring that we're using all of our love languages, where maybe beforehand it was maybe just a more physical thing. But what can we really do that's practical and that we can show children how much we love and care about them? So connection, using our love languages, and then regulation. So what is regulation? Regulation is to try and help children who are distressed and physiologically aroused to calm that down. I don't mean in terms of telling kids to calm down. I mean in terms of helping their bodies and their brains to not be so fearful. So what we know is that connection, what is important about connection is that it needs to be mutually enjoyable. There's no point in a parent sitting down and doing an activity with the child if the child can sense immediately that the parent isn't enjoying this. It needs to be enjoyable. It needs to be something that we both invested in. And we really need to learn to listen to our children. We obviously also need to tailor our regulatory strategies to the children's capacities and realities. So there's no point in saying to somebody, take out your Play-Doh and, just squish it until you're feeling a little bit more calm, if you don't even, you've never even seen Play-Doh. And of course, we also know that how the parent or the caregiver or the teacher regulates themselves will be what the child is hearing about the stress. So we as grown-ups need to be managing and regulating our own distress in order to help children regulate and lower their levels of arousal. So I've given you a couple of ideas here, some really very basic ideas of what children can do to just help lower their levels of arousal. And please keep in mind, these are not things that we need to tell children to do. These are things we need to do with children. We need to practice them. Teachers, if they can be routinely engaging in this at the end of a break, let's make it a part of a routine. Let's practice this with children. We're not going to watch them do it. We're going to actually do it with them. These little pictures here, they're called calming cards, and I found them on Pinterest. So please go and have a look. There's the most amazing resources everywhere, really. But do things that are appropriate for the families that you work with. Expressing emotions. Keep in mind that for a lot of our cultures and communities, expressing emotions are not necessarily encouraged in children. Many children would, there's still this idea of children should be seen and not heard. And so for some children, they don't have the words, they don't have the awareness, they don't have the experience of actually sharing some of their emotions and what it is that they are dealing with. And so, again, we can be just beginning really basic conversations with children about emotions, and just even teaching a word can already help to be bringing down a level of anxiety. Now, this is really important. Do you speak child? Now, what does this mean? Well, on a verbal level, obviously, we need to be bringing our language down to the level of the child, but non-verbally, even more so. Children in distress are going to be much more focused on your non-verbal language than your verbal language. So please remember that what you're saying non-verbally is really very important, if not more important. We need to understand that for children, knowing and understanding is different. Children know they need to wash their hands. They know they need to social distance, but they don't necessarily always understand why or what that is about. And of course, knowing children who are very spontaneous, they don't always remember what it is that they should or shouldn't be doing in the heat of the moment. I had a little girl who I wear sort of a face shield during my session, and she took it off my face and put it on her face and was very excited to try on my face shield. And I thought to myself, what do I do here? Do I rip it out of her hands and kind of give her the fright of her life? Or do we just deal with the fact that we're just going to have to take a breath and sanitize? Please keep in mind also our children with disabilities being exceptionally vulnerable on all kinds of levels and needing a lot of input. And we need to learn to speak their child as well. Our frontline workers need to have trauma-informed psychological first aid. They need tools, they need information. And I think if you are somebody who's experienced in working in the field of trauma, probably one of the most effective things you could be doing now to help the most amount of children is to be giving tools and information to the people who are on the front line. So whether this is a clinic sister or a teacher or a community member, we are never going to get to all of the children as therapists or social workers. It's not possible, but we can be sharing and thereby empowering other people to help children with the psychological first aid. Because for me, what's really important is that we cannot re-traumatize our children. I'm so concerned that when children go back to school and they are dysregulated and they are jumping around and causing noise and being, in inverted commas, impossible, that a teacher who's not understanding their behavior is going to be shouting and punishing and disciplining. And that in a way, what we're doing, we're just re-traumatizing and we're just escalating this sense of arousal for children. And so that is why the psychological first aid is so important. I also love the idea of mastery. So helping children do things that they are able to manage. And for very many children who come from under-resourced areas, making something as simple as coloring in a picture, making something out of Play-Doh, baking something, they haven't had these experiences necessarily before. So we can just really be creative, whether it's therapeutic stories, whether it's little games that we develop for them, whether it's brag bracelets that children can wear. And these are all inexpensive little ideas, and I have shared some of them with Heather from Ispacan, and she will be sharing those with you as well. What I also like about mastery activities is that they very often can also be transitional objects. So children can take this home, they can take that sense of what they've learned and how they've felt cared for home with them and stick it on their window or stick it on their wall. Please remember, from under-resourced communities, you don't have anything to glue it onto the wall with, so send home some what we call press stick. And so really in closing, I think for me, among all the terrible things that COVID has brought, I think it has brought with it an opportunity for us to reimagine what psychosocial and psychological services can be. We don't have to go back to pre-COVID. We have the opportunity to reimagine, and I'd love to see us start being much more creative and thinking outside of the box. COVID is giving us the opportunity and the permission to really be creative and sharing, please, and sharing. So from my side, thank you very much for everything that you do for our children. You will see our contact details on here, Dr. Joan van Niekerk and myself. And the presentations will also be available to you. And I've worked really hard at not taking up too many of the minutes so that we do have time for questions and conversations. So over to you, Heather.
Great, thank you so much. And I think we'll just leave this slide up during the questions so people can access your email addresses. That would be great. We do have lots of great questions coming in. First, I'll start with, you mentioned, I think Joan mentioned at the beginning of her presentation, the lack of clear communication to some of the impoverished communities about what lockdown is and some of the aspects of that. And can you speak a little bit to how communication generally happens, and if you have recommendations for people in situations, how to help get the word out about this important information in those types of communities?
Yes, I think it's really important to, first of all, in a country like ours, to translate. Translation, though, is costly. I think the second thing is to use community radio, in which you hopefully will have a person who is able to not just translate from something that is written in the official language to looking at something that, translating it into something that is more in the vernacular of the listeners, but also to simplify our words. Flattening the curve is something I keep on going back to in my head. But masks, what is a mask? Is a mask something that covers your whole face? Is it something you dress up in to pretend that you're Superman or Superwoman? So this kind of thing, and also start with the context of the child or the context of the adult. What can you actually link the information to that is part of this person's world already, so that you can illustrate and make it kind of more meaningful to that person. I think communication, especially when it comes to messages as important as the messages around COVID, we also need to be using communication experts. We need to be using more visual materials. Obviously, though, those cost to print. Even on television, though, we should be using more visual materials. And I'll just tell you about one advert in South Africa, which has virtually driven me crazy. And that is, wash your hands for 20 seconds and don't touch the tap when you've finished. Okay. And you see this person with this beautiful basin, this beautiful tap. She can close the tap with her elbow. She washes her hands for the whole, sorry, it's not 20 minutes, it's 20 seconds, sorry. You see this tap running for 20 seconds. We live in a country with a massive water shortage. You can't leave a tap running for 20 seconds. So you've got to actually make the message fit the context. That to me is really important. Edith, what else would you like to? Oh, sometimes giving children messages, it's important to use song, dance, drama, and so on. And we find that many of our African children are amazing at role plays, amazing at dance and rhythm. And so these are things within their context that they experience very frequently and can be used to give messages and underline messages. Edith, please add.
Maybe just to add, therapeutic stories. We are a nation of storytelling. And I think stories can be a very powerful way of sharing healing messages with children. I think also by engaging with children, we are then also allowing children to take the information home and share in their communities. And one of the things I think we also need to think about is there are so many distribution points, not enough distribution points of food. How can we use those opportunities to be sharing mental health messaging? It's another opportunity of how we can connect with the people who need it most.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. We've had a couple of questions and concerns about children who are maybe in situations where there's a lack of supervision when they're having to be at home and parents have to work. And I guess I'm just wondering how services, what happened to the services in general when lockdown started in South Africa? Did things move online, or how are people watching out for those children?
Edith, do you want to start with that one?
So maybe just to start with the fact of everything's gone online, but the majority of our country doesn't have access to online. So, realistically, it's not a very helpful way of communicating with our families. And now I've just lost my train of thought. Help me.
I I think what you've said is very important. The assumption is that the internet is everywhere, and very few children have access to the internet. And when they do, they have to pay for data. We have very few areas in which there is free data, and now with the lockdown, you couldn't go to those areas. You couldn't go and sit outside McDonald's and crib on their internet, you know what I mean? And so it's really not the best way to try and get messages across in South Africa. Community radio seems to be the most universally available in South Africa at the moment. And so it's important that one tries to get messages through your community radio, for us anyway.
I think one of the big concerns for anyone working in the field of child protection is where we are at now, where some of the schools, some of the grades are going back. Our youngest children, so our children up until the age of 5 or 6, we don't actually have any directives as to what's going to happen to them when parents went back to school on Monday. We don't know who's looking after the children. Many of the children are really roaming the streets, and child abuse offenders, I'm sure they think Christmas has come early, excuse my really crude way of saying that. But in South Africa, at least, we do have a concept called Ubuntu, which is really about saying, I am because you are. I cannot exist without you existing. And to really try to get our families, our communities to really re-engage with something that has been very much part of the African culture that we need to re-engage with, because I think it's so important. And we really have seen the most amazing examples of where people in communities have literally just stood up and done the most creative, amazing things. And so for me, I think, again, it's an opportunity for us to reimagine, to rethink what it is that we need to do, as it's not the solution per se, and we need to keep on ensuring that we're advocating for schools and creches and ECD centers to open up for children, because they need food, they need protection, they need supervision. But let's try and think of how can we encourage communities to go back to the value of Ubuntu.
Perhaps we should mention that we have school feeding programs in disadvantaged communities, and those have all closed. And this is why food became such an issue. And many of the children in the children's consultation did talk about access to food and their concerns about that. And that's a really basic need. And you can look, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's all very well to look at some of the issues around school and so on, but if a child has a rumbling tum, nothing is going to really shift into that head, because all they can hear is their own body saying, I'm hungry.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we have time for just one more question. We're about at time. Some attendees are asking about, appreciating these great resources that you're sharing, and wondering how they might be adapted for teens or older children, and also some questions about children with disabilities, which you mentioned briefly. But anything you can say about adapting resources or your recommendations for those two groups?
So I think one of the things that we mustn't forget is child participation, and if in this example, teen participation. How can we be saying to teens, what do you need? How can we be using maybe an idea like one of the resources and adapt it? Storytelling works exceptionally well with teenagers. Obviously, you need to adapt the story. Positive, instead of having brag bracelets, you could be having positive affirmation cards that children, or a bookmark. So, it really is about just taking ideas and running with it and being creative. And who more creative than our children themselves, and ask them to help us produce something that's relevant to them.
Mm. And just to add to that, sometimes what the things that we think are appropriate for children may not be, and vice versa. One of the things that really surprised me about our consultation with children was, despite the violence of the police and the army, a significant number of children, it was the second to most frequent request made to government and organizations to have the police and army in their communities. I find that absolutely interesting. It would, for me, have been possibly the last thing. And it shows how wrong you can be unless you ask children themselves to tell you how they perceive their needs.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, I think we are about at time as far as questions. I would like to thank everyone in the audience for sharing your questions and comments with us. And again, if you have a question that did not get answered, you can reach out to Joan or Edit here. Their information is on the screen. And I'm going to change screens here for just our conclusion here. One moment. Okay, so thank you everyone, and thank you so much to Joan and Edit for being with us today and sharing this information. We invite all of you to visit ISPCAN's COVID-19 resources page for a variety of resources for different disciplines, as well as for parents and children. There's a screenshot of it here. You will also find information about our upcoming webinars related to COVID-19, including one next week on our ISPCAN child abuse screening tools, and one on June 19th about COVID-19 data collection efforts. And we encourage all of you to become a member of ISPCAN if you're not already, so that we can continue having webinars like these. Our member benefits include discounts to our congresses, which will resume in 2021 in Italy and Australia. We offer several membership levels, including professional, student, emeritus, group membership, and associate membership, which starts at just $35 a year. To learn more about ISPCAN, please visit us at ispcan.org. And a reminder that the slides from today's webinar are available now in the handouts section of this webinar and will be posted on our website shortly, as well as a recording. If you have any questions or comments about today's webinar or upcoming webinars, please contact us at resources@ispcan.org. And again, please reach out to Joan or Edit if you have any questions that did not get answered today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We hope you stay safe and healthy and stay strong and have a great day or night wherever you are. Joan and Edith, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Our pleasure. Thank you. Be safe and be blessed.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.